June 6, 1944. Somewhere in Normandy, a German soldier on patrol stumbles upon something strange in a darkened field. The pre-dawn hours have brought chaos to the Norman countryside. Reports are flooding in from every direction. Paratroopers, thousands of them, dropping from the sky across a vast stretch of occupied France. The invasion everyone has been expecting for months is finally happening. The soldier approaches what appears to be a fallen paratrooper. The parachute lies deflated nearby, its white silk barely visible in the darkness. But something is wrong. The body is too small, too light. When he pulls at the uniform, his fingers close around rough burlap fabric stuffed with straw and sand. This is not a soldier. This is a doll. A crude, child-sized dummy dressed in boots and a helmet. Before he can process what he has found, a burst of gunfire erupts from somewhere in the tree line. Voices shout commands in English. The crackle of mortar rounds echoes across the fields. Elsewhere in the night, similar scenes are playing out. German units are reporting massive airborne landings in locations scattered across dozens of miles. Officers are scrambling to respond. Reserves are being mobilized, panzer divisions are changing direction, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in Western Europe, is about to order more than half of an elite SS Panzer division to chase after an enemy that does not exist. What the Germans cannot possibly know in those frantic hours is that they are responding exactly as the British have planned. The straw-filled dummies are not a failed deception discovered too late. They are a precisely calibrated psychological weapon designed to exploit the fog of war at the most critical moment in modern military history, and they are about to help change the course of that history. Because on D-Day, some of the most effective soldiers dropped into Normandy were made of burlap and straw. The challenge, facing Allied planners in early 1944, was both simple to describe and monumentally difficult to solve. Everyone knew an invasion was coming. The Germans knew it. The French resistance knew it. The entire world understood that at some point, the Western Allies would attempt to land a massive army somewhere on the coast of occupied Europe. The question was not whether but where and when. For the Germans, this uncertainty was both a vulnerability and an advantage. Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a system of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Thousands of bunkers, gun emplacements, beach obstacles, and minefields had transformed the coastline into a fortress. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had been placed in command of defending the French coast, and had thrown himself into the task with characteristic energy. Under his direction, millions of mines were laid, steel obstacles planted on the beaches and Rommel's Park, wooden stakes designed to impale gliders erected in fields throughout the invasion zone. But no defensive line could be equally strong everywhere. The key to German strategy was predicting the invasion point and concentrating forces there. The Pas de Calais seemed the obvious choice. It offered the shortest crossing of the English Channel, barely 20 miles from Dover to Calais. It provided the most direct route into the German heartland. Logic suggested the Allies would choose this point of maximum efficiency. German High Command had fortified Calais heavily and positioned some of their best formations nearby. But the Allied planners had chosen Normandy instead. The beaches there were less heavily defended. The terrain offered opportunities for establishing a beachhead, and precisely because it was the less obvious choice, it offered the possibility of surprise. Surprise, however, was not merely desirable. It was essential. The mathematics of amphibious assault were brutal and unforgiving. Landing troops from ships onto defended beaches under fire from prepared positions was one of the most difficult operations in warfare. The first waves of attackers would be vulnerable in the extreme, struggling through surf and open sand, while defenders fired from concrete bunkers. If the Germans could concentrate their forces at the landing beaches before the Allies established a firm foothold, they could push the invasion back into the sea. The Allied plan therefore required not just military force, but military deception on a scale never before attempted. The Germans must not only be surprised by the initial landing, they must remain confused about the true nature of the invasion, even after it began. They must be prevented from committing their reserves until it was too late. Every hour of German hesitation could save thousands of Allied lives. This was the strategic context that gave birth to Operation Bodyguard, the most elaborate deception campaign in military history. The name itself came from a remark attributed to Winston Churchill, who reportedly said that, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Bodyguard was not a single plan, but an interlocking series of more than 35 subordinate operations designed to convince the Germans that the invasion could come anywhere and might not be the main effort, even when it arrived. Planning had begun in earnest after the Tehran Conference in November 1943, when Churchill promised Stalin they would open a second front in Western Europe by May of the following year. The London Controlling Section, a secret group of military officers dedicated to strategic deception, coordinated the overall effort. The centerpiece was Operation Fortitude, which created an entirely fictional army group under General George Patton, the American commander the Germans most feared and respected. This phantom force, the first United States Army group, supposedly massed in southeast England, directly across from Calais. Inflatable tanks dotted the countryside. Fake radio traffic buzzed through the airwaves. Double agents fed German intelligence, a steady diet of carefully crafted misinformation. The most valuable of these double agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British and Alaric by the Germans. Garcia had created a fictional network of 27 agents supposedly operating across Britain, none of whom actually existed. The Germans trusted Garbo so completely that they awarded him the Iron Cross for his services. He was so effective that Hitler refused to release reinforcements from the Calais area to Normandy for nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, convinced that a second, larger invasion was still coming. Fortitude North threatened Norway from Scotland, using fake radio traffic and dummy equipment to suggest a British Fourth Army preparing to attack across the North Sea. Fortitude South focused on the Pas de Calais, the most obvious and logical invasion route. Together, they created an impression of Allied strength far greater than actually existed and threatened. So many potential targets that the Germans could not concentrate their forces anywhere, but strategic deception alone would not be enough. When the actual invasion fleet approached Normandy, when real paratroopers began dropping from the sky, the Germans would have to respond to the reality on the ground. At that moment, a different kind of deception would be required, not the grand strategic fiction of phantom armies, but tactical confusion in the critical hour. When German commanders were trying to understand what was happening and decide how to react, this tactical deception would involve dropping hundreds of dummy paratroopers across Normandy, in locations carefully chosen to draw German forces away from the real landing zones. The dummy paratroopers themselves were remarkably simple devices. Officially designated device camouflage number 15, they were essentially human-shaped bags made from Hessian cloth, the same rough burlap material used for sandbags and potato sacks. Each dummy stood roughly 85 centimeters tall, about half the height of an actual soldier, and weighed just a few pounds when stuffed with straw or sand. The concept was not entirely new. The Germans themselves had used dummy parachutists during their blitzkrieg through the Low Countries in May 1940. First Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig, who commanded the assault on Fort Ebony Mail in Belgium, later recalled that dummy figures were dropped behind the Albert Canal as a final stroke of ingenuity. The deception caused considerable confusion in the Belgian command during the critical first hours of the German attack. The Allies had begun developing their own version in the late 1930s. According to some accounts, an American manufacturer named George Friedman, operating a small fabrication business in Ashland, Massachusetts, was approached by a British Trade Commission agent around 1938 or 39. Friedman and his brother Fred agreed to secretly produce a small dummy paratrooper with a parachute. The brothers designed, tested, and produced the device that would eventually be known as Rupert. Nearly 4,000 units were reportedly shipped to Britain via Canada before the war began. The design reflected a fundamental insight about perception under stress. A parachute descending through darkness looks much the same regardless of what hangs beneath it. German observers on the ground, watching shapes drop from aircraft in the middle of the night, would see parachutes and assume paratroopers. The brain fails in what the eye cannot clearly see. By the time anyone got close enough to examine the dummies, they would have already served their purpose. The nickname these devices acquired tells its own story. British troops called them Ruperts, a slang term used by enlisted men to describe inexperienced young officers who were useless without someone to guide them. The Americans had their own name, Oscar. Either way, the implicit joke was the same. These were soldiers who could not fight, could not think, and could not do anything useful on their own. Their only value was in how others perceived them. But perception was precisely the point. The Ruperts did not need to fool anyone for long. They needed to create confusion during the crucial opening phase of the invasion, when German commanders were receiving fragmentary reports from all directions and trying to assemble a coherent picture of what was happening. The Ruperts were equipped with several features designed to extend and enhance the deception. Each dummy carried a small explosive charge, timed to detonate upon landing. This innovation is sometimes credited to Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., the Hollywood actor who became a highly decorated naval officer during the war. Fairbanks had trained with British combined operations under Lord Louis Mountbatten, learning the arts of military deception that he would later bring to American naval operations. Whether or not he specifically contributed to the Rupert design, the self-destruct feature reflected the kind of theatrical thinking that deception specialists like Fairbanks championed. The explosive charges served multiple purposes. They destroyed the evidence, burning away the cloth and leaving only scattered debris. That might be mistaken for a paratrooper who had disposed of his equipment. They also created the impression that the soldier was still active somewhere, having burned his parachute, as trained paratroopers often did to prevent the enemy from tracking their landing zones. More sophisticated devices accompanied the dummies. Rifle fire simulators called pintails were attached to some of the parachutes. These small pyrotechnic devices produced the crackling sound of gunfire when they hit the ground, making it seem as though the phantom paratroopers were engaging enemy forces. Additional devices fired very lights and produced explosions that simulated mortar fire. But the most crucial element of the operation was not the dummies themselves. It was the small number of real soldiers who would jump alongside them. The men selected for this mission came from the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment, an elite British unit specializing in unconventional warfare behind enemy lines. The SAS had been formed in the North African desert, where small team conducted daring raids against Axis airfields and supply lines. They were among the most experienced and capable special operations soldiers in the world. When the intelligence officer for the SAS Brigade, MRD Foot, was ordered to arrange the Special Forces contingent for the dummy drops, he first approached Lieutenant Colonel Paddy Mayne, the legendary commander of the 1st SAS Regiment. Mayne refused. He had bad experiences with deception operations in North Africa, considered the mission a futile waste of highly trained soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks of the 2nd SAS Regiment was eventually convinced to provide 12 men for the operation. Franks had taken command of the 2nd SAS just 2 days before D-Day, on June 4th, replacing Bill Sterling. Despite being brand new to command, he agreed to participate. The volunteers understood the dangers. They would be dropping deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by German forces with orders not to evade capture, but to actively engage the enemy and then let some of them escape. The purpose was to ensure that German soldiers who encountered the drop zones would report paratroopers, not dummies. The SAS men would provide the living proof that made the straw soldiers believable. Captain Frederick Fowles and Lieutenant Norman Poole commanded the two teams. Their mission briefing explained that they would carry gramophone players loaded with recordings of battle sounds. 30 minutes of men shouting, weapons firing, and mortars exploding. They would play these recordings at high volume through speaker systems parachuted in with the dummies, creating an auditory landscape of combat that would reinforce the visual illusion. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily dangerous assignment. The SAS teams would be the first Allied soldiers to land on French soil on D-Day itself, preceding even the glider forces that would capture Pegasus Bridge by several minutes. They would be operating alone, deep in enemy territory, deliberately attracting attention from German forces, who outnumbered them by enormous margins, and they were expected to do this knowing that their primary purpose was not military victory but theatrical illusion. The operation was divided into 4 phases, designated Titanic 1 through Titanic 4. Each targeted different areas of Normandy with different combinations of dummies, noisemakers, and SAS personnel. Titanic 1 would drop 200 dummies and 2 SAS teams in the area north of the Seine River, near the towns of Yvetot, Yeovil, Doudeville, and Fauville. This drop zone was positioned to suggest a major airborne landing threatening the German forces along the Seine, drawing reserves northward away from the actual invasion beaches. Titanic 2 was planned to drop 50 dummies east of the Dives River to pull German reserves in that direction. This phase was cancelled at the last moment due to heavy air traffic over Normandy. Titanic 3 would drop 50 dummies in the Calvados region near Maltert and the woods north of Baron-sur-Adorn, southwest of Caen. This would draw German attention away from the actual drop zones of the British 6th Airborne Division. Titanic 4 was the most ambitious phase. 200 dummies and 2 SAS teams would be dropped near Marigny, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, near Saint-Lô. The objective was to simulate another full airborne division landing, pulling German counter-attack forces westward away from the invasion beaches. 4 squadrons from No. 3 Group of the Royal Air Force would carry out the drops. Numbers 138 and 161 squadrons flew Handley Page Halifaxes and Lockheed Hudsons. Numbers 90 and 149 squadrons flew Short Stirlings. These were the Special Duties Squadrons, units that had spent years dropping agents and supplies to resistance networks across occupied Europe. They were accustomed to flying dangerous missions in darkness over hostile territory. The timing was precise. The SAS teams assigned to Titanic 4 were scheduled to land at midnight on June 6, 1944. They would be among the very first Allied soldiers to touch French soil on D-Day. The dummies would begin falling across Normandy in the early hours of the morning, just as German commanders were beginning to receive the first confused reports of airborne activity. What happened next validated the entire concept of tactical deception in ways that exceeded the planners' most optimistic projections. At 2 in the morning on June 6th, German units began reporting parachute landings across a vast area of Normandy. Paratroopers had been spotted east of Caen. More were landing near Coutances. Still others were dropping near Valognes and Saint-Lô. The reports were fragmentary, contradictory, and urgent. Something massive was happening in the night sky over Normandy, but no one could say exactly what. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the German 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, placed his forces on full invasion alert. This was the moment of crisis that German planners had anticipated for months. The question now was how to respond. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B, initially reduced the alert level after receiving reports that only dummy parachutists had been found at some locations. The discovery of Ruperts suggested that the airborne activity might be a deception rather than a genuine invasion, but this assessment only increased the confusion. Were all the parachute drops fakes? Some of them? Which reports could be trusted? Uncertainty had engulfed the German command structure at precisely the moment when clarity was most essential. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West, made a fateful decision. He ordered more than half of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to deal with a reported parachute landing near Lisieux. This was one of the elite armored formations stationed near the invasion coast. Young soldiers of the Hitler Youth commanded by veterans of the Eastern Front. They were among the most dangerous units in the German order of battle. The 12th SS had been positioned near Lisieux specifically to counterattack any Allied landing on the Normandy beaches. They had tanks, artillery, and thousands of motivated soldiers. If they had moved directly toward the invasion beaches in the early hours of June 6th, they could have added enormous weight to the German defense at a critical moment. Instead, they went chasing after straw men. The parachute landing near Lisieux was Titanic 3. 50 burlap dummies stuffed with straw and sand, accompanied by rifle fire simulators and explosive charges. There were no Allied soldiers at Lisieux. There was no airborne division. There was only an illusion created by cloth and pyrotechnics. By the time the SS troops reached the drop zone and discovered the truth, hours had passed. The division was not fully deployed toward the invasion beaches until 2:30. In the afternoon, more than 12 hours after the first reports of the landings, their advance was then further slowed by Allied air attacks and the chaos of refugees clogging the Norman roads. The first units of the 12th SS did not reach their assembly area near Evreysy until 10 in the evening on D-Day. Elsewhere, the story was similar. The German 915th Grenadier Regiment, part of the 352nd Infantry Division that was defending Omaha Beach, received orders shortly after midnight to investigate reported paratrooper landings south of the key crossroads town of Carentan. This was the only reserve force available to the corps defending the Normandy coast. Lieutenant Colonel Karl Mayer assembled his grenadiers and had them on the road by 3 in the morning. They spent hours navigating the narrow country lanes of Normandy in darkness, searching for an enemy. That existed only in the imagination of German commanders who had seen reports of the dummy drops. By the time the sun rose and the vast Allied invasion fleet came into view, Mayer's regiment was still on the road, nowhere near the beaches where they were desperately needed. Around 7 in the morning, a new report reached Corps headquarters. There had been no airborne drops south of Carrington, after all. It had been a mistake, a rumor, a misinterpretation of the dummy landings. The 915th was ordered to turn around and head east to counter the British landings instead. But even this simple order proved difficult to execute. The regiment had to reverse direction on narrow roads already filling with refugees and military traffic. By the time they were finally in position to attack, they ran straight into advancing British forces supported by tanks and air power. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer was killed. The bulk of his regiment was scattered in a hasty retreat. The cost of chasing dummies was measured in hours and opportunities. German forces that should have been reinforcing the beach defenses spent the critical early hours of D-Day responding to phantom threats. Panzer divisions that could have counterattacked the vulnerable beachheads were delayed, divided, and confused. The reserves that German defensive doctrine depended upon were committed piecemeal against threat. That did not exist. Meanwhile, the real Allied paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were accomplishing their actual mission. They were seizing bridges, destroying gun emplacements, and blocking German reinforcement routes. The confusion created by the dummy drops had given them precious hours to organize and consolidate. The scale of the actual D-Day operation was staggering. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy on June 6th, including more than 23,000 airborne soldiers who arrived by parachute and glider. Nearly 7,000 naval vessels participated in the invasion, supported by approximately 12,000 aircraft. The Allies suffered more than 10,000 casualties on D-Day itself, including over 4,000 killed. Against this massive operation, Operation Titanic deployed roughly 500 dummy paratroopers and 12 SAS soldiers. The contrast in scale underscores the efficiency of deception as a force multiplier. A handful of men and a few hundred straw-filled dummies influenced the deployment of divisions. The human cost of Operation Titanic was concentrated among the small number of SAS soldiers who had volunteered for the mission. 8 men from the SS failed to return. They were either killed in action during the initial drops or captured by the Germans and later executed. The Titanic 4 team, commanded by Captain Fowles and Lieutenant Poole, landed at 20 past midnight, as planned, 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Their drop was scattered across a wide area, and they were unable to locate the containers carrying their equipment. The gramophone players that were supposed to broadcast sounds of battle had smashed on landing. The men found themselves deep behind German lines with only their personal weapons. For over 40 days, the SAS soldiers evaded German forces with help from the French resistance. They moved constantly to avoid German troops, including a German parachute battalion that moved into their area. At one point, they learned that 3 American paratroopers were hiding in a barn 10 miles away, soldiers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment who had escaped from a German prisoner transport. 3 of the SAS men walked through the night to reach them. One of the Americans was badly wounded and could not walk, so Trooper Anthony Merriweather carried him the entire way back. Eventually, the combined group attempted to reach Allied lines. They walked into 2 German paratroopers who threw grenades, wounding Captain Fowle in the back, Trooper Hurst in the legs, and Trooper Merriweather in the back. Within minutes, the small farmhouse where they had taken shelter was surrounded by 40 heavily armed German paratroopers. The SAS men had no choice but to surrender. They were fortunate, perhaps because they were captured close to the front lines, or because their captors were fellow paratroopers, or because Lieutenant Poole spoke German and convinced them that the British soldiers were not special forces. They were not executed as so many SAS prisoners were during the war. They spent the remainder of the conflict in prisoner of war camps. Trooper Merriweather received a military medal for his actions during the operation. A Frenchman named André Leduc, who had helped shelter the evading soldiers, was later killed by the Germans. 2 short Sterling aircraft from 149 Squadron were lost during the Titanic drops. Sterling LJ 621. Piloted by Pilot Officer W.S. Mayo, crashed near Caen with 6 killed, 2 taken prisoner, and 1 who evaded capture. Sterling LK 385, piloted by Squadron Leader C.J.K. Hutchin, crashed into a farmhouse at borders south of Saint-Lô with all crew lost. These losses must be measured against what the operation achieved. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, approximately 500 dummy paratroopers, and a handful of extraordinarily brave SAS soldiers create the illusion of multiple airborne divisions landing across Normandy. They drew German reserves away from the invasion beaches. They delayed the commitment of panzer forces by critical hours. They contributed to the confusion that prevented the German command from mounting an effective counterattack during the vulnerable first day of the invasion. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let me explain why this success reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare. The dummy paratroopers of Operation Titanic illustrate a principle that military theorists would refine over subsequent decades. In conditions of uncertainty, the cost of reacting to potential threats almost always exceeds the cost of creating those threats. The defender must guard against everything. The attacker chooses what illusions to create. Consider the resources involved. The Allies invested a modest quantity of burlap fabric, straw, sand, and pyrotechnic devices. The manufacturing cost was negligible. The logistics were simple. A few aircraft carrying bundles of cloth could simulate the presence of thousands of soldiers. The German response consumed vastly more resources. An elite SS Panzer division, one of the most valuable formations in the German order of battle, spent hours pursuing a phantom threat. Infantry regiments that should have reinforced the beach defenses marched away from where they were needed. Staff officers at every level of command struggled to process contradictory reports and make decisions based on incomplete information. The ratio of Allied investment to German response was extraordinarily favorable. A few hundred pounds of straw and fabric produced effects that would have required multiple genuine airborne divisions to achieve through direct action. This asymmetry is not accidental. It emerges from the fundamental structure of military command and control. Commanders make decisions based on information. That information comes from reports filed by subordinates who are themselves operating with limited visibility. At every step in the chain, there are opportunity for confusion, misinterpretation, and error. Deception operations exploit these structural vulnerabilities. They do not need to create perfect illusion. They need only inject additional uncertainty into a system already struggling to process incomplete information under time pressure. A few false data points, inserted at the right moment, can propagate through the command structure and shape decisions at the highest levels. The 12th SS Panzer Division was not fooled by rubber mannequins that looked exactly like soldiers. They were deployed based on reports from subordinates who had seen parachutes descending in darkness and drawn reasonable conclusions about what those parachutes carried. By the time anyone examined the evidence closely enough to discover the truth, the decision had already been made, and the division was already in motion. This principle extends far beyond the specific circumstances of D-Day. Modern military doctrine recognizes deception as a force multiplier that can achieve effects disproportionate to the resources invested. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, misleading troop movements all operate on the same fundamental logic that made the Ruperts effective. The dummy paratroopers also demonstrated the importance of what military planners call tactical synchronization. Operation Titanic was not an isolated deception. It was one element of a comprehensive plan that included strategic deception through fortitude, naval deception through operations Glimmer and Taxable, and the actual airborne and amphibious assaults of D-Day itself. Each element reinforced the others. The strategic fiction of the 1st United States Army Group at Calais made the Germans uncertain about whether Normandy was the main invasion or a diversion. The naval deceptions of operations Glimmer and Taxable used aircraft dropping aluminum chaff and small boats towing radar reflectors to simulate invasion fleets approaching other parts of the French coast. The tactical deception of the dummy drops added another layer of confusion. During the critical hours when that uncertainty could influence decision, the real paratroopers landing at genuine objectives provided enough authentic activity to make all the reports seem plausible. Window, the code name for radar reflective chaff, was dropped by aircraft flying precise patterns that made the German radar screens show what appeared to be massive naval formations heading toward Boulogne and other points along the coast. Small motor launches equipped with special equipment called moonshine amplified their radar signatures to appear as large troop transports. The Germans, watching their radar screens, saw threats materializing everywhere at once. German commanders were not stupid. They recognized almost immediately that some of the parachute drops were fakes. General Speidel reduced the alert level after dummy parachutists were discovered. But this knowledge did not solve their problem. It created a new one. Now they had to determine which reports were genuine and which were deceptions. They had to make that determination quickly, in the middle of the night, based on fragmentary information from subordinates who were themselves uncertain. The dummy paratroopers succeeded not because they fooled everyone, but because they made it impossible for anyone to be certain. In warfare, uncertainty is often more paralyzing than ignorance. A commander who knows nothing must act on assumption. A commander who knows that some of his information is false but cannot tell which parts faces a much harder problem. The legacy of Operation Titanic extended beyond D-Day and beyond the Second World War entirely. The operation entered popular culture through the 1962 film The Longest Day, which depicted German soldiers discovering the dummy paratroopers. In the film, the Germans refer to the dummies as Gummipuppen or rubber dolls, though this term may have been a dramatic invention rather than an actual German military designation, and the real Ruperts were made of burlap rather than rubber. The movie dramatized the confusion and doubt that the dummies sowed among German commanders, showing them struggling to determine whether reports of paratroopers were genuine or merely distractions. The use of dummy paratroopers continued into subsequent conflicts. During the invasion of southern France in August 1944, Operation Dragoon, 600 Ruperts were dropped to simulate airborne landings away from the actual assault areas. Axis Sally, the German radio propagandist, reportedly called them the product of a fiendish Anglo-Saxon mind. The technique had proven its value. American military planners developed their own versions of the concept. The Oscar dummy evolved through several iterations during and after the war, incorporating improvements based on operational experience. Paradummies remained in the American arsenal of deception techniques well into the 1970s, available for use in contingency plans that were never executed. The broader principles demonstrated by Titanic influenced the development of electronic warfare, information operations, and psychological operations throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The fundamental insight that perception can be more important than reality became a cornerstone of military thinking. About conflicts in which nuclear weapons made direct confrontation between great powers unthinkably destructive. Today, the surviving artifacts of Operation Titanic are preserved in museums across the world. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a Rupert on display. The Merville Bunker Museum, the Kane Memorial, and the Omaha Beach Memorial in Normandy all exhibit examples. The Imperial War Museum in London holds specimens that were never used in operation, discovered in the 1980s in storage at a Royal Air Force base. Few genuine D-Day Ruperts survived the war. The explosive charges that were supposed to destroy them did their job effectively. The cloth burned, the straw scattered, and the evidence disappeared. The very success of the self-destruct mechanism means that original operational examples are extraordinarily rare. When authentic specimens do appear at auction, they command significant prices. A Rupert sold at heritage auctions in 2011 brought over $3,000. Another example sold in 2017 for approximately £2,500. These simple cloth bags, worth perhaps a few shillings when they were manufactured, have become precious artifacts of one of history's most consequential military operations. The men who dropped alongside the Ruperts received less recognition than they deserved. The SAS operations on D-Day were classified for decades after the war. The details of Operation Titanic emerged only gradually as archives were opened, and veterans began telling their stories. Even now, the full story of what those 12 SAS soldiers accomplished and endured remains less well known than the more dramatic airborne assaults of the American and British parachute division. Yet their contribution was essential. Without living soldiers to provide gunfire and movement, the dummy drops would have been discovered immediately. The German reports of parachute landings would have been corrected within minutes instead of hours. The confusion that delayed the 12th SS and scattered the 915th Grenadiers would never have occurred. The Ruperts could not fight. They could not think. They could not do anything at all except fall from the sky and lie in the fields of Normandy. But they did not need to fight. They needed only to be seen, to be reported, to be mistaken for something they were not during those vital first hours when that mistake could matter. The SAS soldiers who jumped with them understood this calculus. They volunteered for a mission that was essentially theatrical, a performance designed to sell an illusion. They risked their lives not to destroy enemy forces, but to convince enemy commanders that forces existed where they did not. It was a strange kind of heroism, measured not in enemies killed but in decisions delayed and reserves misdirected. On the morning of June 6, 1944, German commanders across Normandy faced an impossible task. Reports flooded in from every direction. Paratroopers here, ships there, airborne landings in locations separated by dozens of miles. Naval bombardment along the entire coast. The invasion that everyone had anticipated was finally happening, but it seemed to be happening everywhere at once. The German officers who ordered the 12th SS to Lisieux and the 915th to Carentan believed they were responding to genuine threats. They were following proper procedure, reacting to intelligence reports with the forces at their disposal. They could not have known that some of those reports were describing burlap bags filled with straw. By the time they discovered the truth, it was too late. The invasion had succeeded, the beachheads were secure, the liberation of Western Europe had begun. And somewhere in the fields of Normandy, the burned remnants of 500 Ruperts lay scattered and forgotten, their brief mission accomplished. The German decision-making failures on D-Day were numerous and consequential. Field Marshal Rommel was away from his command, visiting his wife for her birthday in Germany. Hitler slept until late morning and refused to release the Panzer reserves without his personal approval. Communications were disrupted by French resistance sabotage and Allied air attacks. But amid all these factors, the confusion sown by Operation Titanic played its part. The German 7th Army War Diary recorded reports of parachute landing across Normandy throughout the night and early morning of June 6th. Officers at every level struggled to distinguish real threats from phantoms. The system designed to defend Fortress Europe against invasion was paralyzed by uncertainty during the decisive early period when rapid response might have made a difference. Today, military academies teach the principles demonstrated by Operation Titanic. Deception remains a fundamental element of military doctrine, recognized for its ability to produce outsized results from minimal investment. The specific techniques have evolved with technology, but the underlying insight remains valid. In conditions of uncertainty, perception shapes decisions as powerfully as reality. The straw soldiers of D-Day earned no medals. They captured no objectives. They fired no shots and took no prisoners. But in the calculus of war, where every hour of delay could mean thousands of lives saved or lost, their contribution was measured in something more valuable than territory or trophies. Because on the longest day, when the fate of Europe hung in the balance, some of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal were not made of steel and explosives, but of cloth and straw. They could not fire a single shot. Their victory was measured in enemies confused, time stolen, and battles that the Germans fought against phantoms, while real soldiers changed the world.